The classic console war may have ended, but there's still a debate to be had.
So pay close attention to what they're saying.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be pitting the Super Nintendo Entertainment System against its counterpart, the Sega Genesis.
A scientist creates the ultimate machine.
At last!
Round 1. Controller. In basic design, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis controllers share certain traits, and feature prominent action buttons for ease of use.
You can also take a look at some of the molding around the buttons. Perhaps you can feel which button you're pushing.
However, the difference is in the details. The SNES controller has 2 shoulder buttons and 4 color-coded buttons arranged in a diamond, whereas the Genesis controller sports 3 large action buttons in a row.
And your thumb can sit down inside of them to get easy grip.
While the Super Nintendo controller scheme has gone on to inspire modern controllers, the Genesis left something to be desired.
The digital pad is incredible, has a slight texture on it, something Microsoft could have learned from when they made their Xbox controller.
A 1993 redesign added 3 more buttons to the Genesis controller, but the resulting crowding on the controller left some critics less than enthused, not to mention early adopters who had to fork out a whole new chunk of cash just to play certain games.
It's still not bad, it is a bit smaller, but you don't have as much to grip onto.
Ultimately, for its controller's instant utility and long-term impact, the Super Nintendo wins this, the first round.
It's light, it's plastic, it's hard, it's practically indestructible.
Round 2. Notable marketing campaigns. The 90s were a time of great competition between game companies, especially when it came to their consoles.
Just for a limited time, buy the Super NES Superset and get 5 complete Mario games standard. Mario!
Naturally, both Nintendo and Sega were at the forefront of this trend, delivering some interesting advertising in the process.
Well, let's see how we did. Ship it!
Sega was fond of the no-holds-barred approach to marketing, which meant targeting Nintendo directly. Its very blunt "Genesis does what Nintendo don't" slogan is perhaps the best-known example. But Sega also made a show of its console's blast processing capabilities.
And what if you don't have blast processing?
And attempted to appeal to a more mature audience. This was also evidenced by the fact that they actively pursued sports titles more than their competitor.
And even my friend Arnie's got a great game. And I get a kick out of soccer and new basketball.
Game's over, Tommy.
Ain't over till it's over.
Nintendo, meanwhile, relied on an update of its Playing with Power message, which was a fun bit of nostalgia, but wasn't quite as hard-hitting as their competitors.
Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Bold marketing is certainly the most memorable, so Sega gets the point.
Sega!
Round 3. Technical capabilities. Graphics and sound definitely aren't everything, but they can add to the overall experience. In the 90s, the goal of engaging players with impressive visuals and sound design was ever present, which factored into the design of both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The Sega Genesis sported the first true 16-bit processor and had 72 kilobytes of RAM, enough to display 64 colors out of a palette of 512. Which was impressive until the arrival of the Super Nintendo, which contained a high-quality audio processor designed by Sony and a video processor that could display over 32,000 colors. And that's to say nothing of its innovative Mode 7 technology, allowing for simulated 3D game environments. Sega later tried to overcome the Genesis' technical inferiority by releasing expensive hardware peripherals known as the Sega CD and the Sega 32X. Nintendo, on the other hand, opted to boost games with the Super FX chip, which was included in the cartridges of certain games. For pushing technological boundaries and staying in the game in a smart way, Nintendo wins this round. Round 4. Notable ported games. Taking existing games from one console to another was not unheard of in the fourth console generation. Yet that generation saw great strides made in the art of porting. Sega boasted a healthy number of arcade ports for the Genesis, including Golden Axe, Virtua Racing, and Altered Beast, though the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat is of particular note, given its fidelity to the 1992 arcade game's bloody violence. Nintendo also had a respectable amount of ports under its belt. For instance, it was the first console to get a version of Street Fighter II, However, certain ported titles for the SNES also suffered from censorship. Speaking of which, it also helped that the Genesis versions of Street Fighter II and the third version of Mortal Kombat were more faithful to the arcade versions than their SNES counterparts.
Sega, master of arcade entertainment, brings the vivid graphics, dynamic sounds, and unsurpassed gameplay of the arcade hits to your home.
As such, Sega earns the point for their prowess in porting.
Arcade screen left, Genesis screen right. If they look the same, you've answered correctly.
Round 5. Exclusive titles. Exclusive games can often showcase the system's best qualities. Both Nintendo and Sega made admirable attempts to appeal to their core audience, though their methods differed. The Super Nintendo launched with the ever-beloved platformer Super Mario World, leading to a decade-long string of memorable exclusives such as Donkey Kong Country, F-Zero, Star Fox, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The SNES also notably had a killer third-party developer on hand with Squaresoft, who brought with them the likes of Final Fantasy III, or 6, whatever, and Chrono Trigger, while Sega's Phantasy Star could really not stand up to these RPG juggernauts. The Genesis, meanwhile, as we saw before, was more built for ports. Sonic the Hedgehog was only released 2 years after the console's launch, and while other exclusive games saw release, including Echo the Dolphin and Gunstar Heroes, they lacked the staying power of Nintendo's exclusives. Think about it this way. In our top 10 games of all time, the SNES had 2 games represented on the list, in the form of Chrono Trigger and Super Mario World, while the Genesis didn't really have any. Thus, for a better lineup of games that have stood the test of time, the SNES takes the final round. Through its then advanced technology and overall abundance of quality, the Super Nintendo stands tall and proud. Now that we've talked about Sega and Nintendo at length, feel free to continue the discussion in the comments below, but please be civil. And of course, be sure to subscribe to WatchMojo.com for more great videos every day.
Until you figure out how to do your job, you're dismissed. Breaking contact.